Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our wonderful presentation today, Life on the Surface, which will be about 50 minutes. My name is Katrina Schlicker. I work for Wild Rivers Conservancy as the Environmental Education Coordinator. I'll be in the background moderating our chat, helping with any technical difficulties. So before we begin, let me mention a couple housekeeping notes. Clicking on the chat icon on the bottom of the screen will open your chat. If you have any technical issues or comments or questions, please put them in there. Any technical issues I will get to as soon as possible, but questions we can save to the end, and I'll help moderate those. Just so you're aware, this session is being recorded. It'll be made permanently available on the Wild Rivers Conservancy YouTube account. And with all of that out of the way, I would like to introduce our speaker and give the rest of the time to them. So please welcome Patterson for his wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much. So my name is Patterson Leeth. It's kind of a weird name. It's two last names, but I didn't get to pick either one of them, as neither of any of us did. But I'm so excited to be here. I've spent my entire life on or around water all over the world and find it extremely fascinating and very important to my life. So I'm very honored to be speaking with all of you today. And my mom is a retired high school principal and educator, so I think she's probably proud of me that I'm finally following in her footsteps, doing something other than being in a boat. But with that being said, I'll get started here. I want to start with a quote from a book that was recently published, and it's going to act as a guide for us to think about what we're going to talk today. And it goes, "The water of each spring and stream is not interchangeable. Water's source matters, its course matters. Each river is differently spirited and differently tongued, and so must be differently honored." And so, with that, just want you guys to think about the fact that while on the surface, a lot of waterways and bodies of water may seem very similar, but they're all unique, just like the individuals that are on this call. And so, just keep that in mind while we're walking through this. But this is a photo actually from the St. Croix. The boat on the far right is my drift boat that I get to spend quite a bit of time paddling some of the rivers that we're going to talk about today. So with that, let's get started. So before we get into sort of this watershed, I wanted to give you an overview of kind of who I am and how this all started for me. I grew up on the Upper James River. It's kind of hard to see here, but if you can see my mouse, it's basically number 11. And it's similar to the St. Croix watershed in that it spans two states. So this one spans Missouri and Arkansas, which you can see over here on the left. This photo on the right is actually my grandmother. This was taken in August of 1972. So this is her floating one of these little blue lines in this green highlighted map. So this type of life on the water has been a part of my family for a very long time. I grew up on the Upper James. It's a small, clear limestone river in the hills of the Ozarks, part of the White River watershed, which actually drains into the Mississippi, just like the St. Croix does, just from a different direction, a different design, a different set of stories and histories. And like I said, it spans two states, Missouri and Arkansas. It's on the same continent, obviously, with the same ultimate destination as the St. Croix, but it has its own spirit entirely, just like every other river. My childhood babysitters were a dog and a river. Seriously, that's not a joke. That's just what it was. I was an only child, and the river was always there. It was there when I was bored, when I was restless, when I needed to think, when I didn't know I needed to think. I learned to read water before I really learned to read much else. Where the current pushed food, where the shade held colder water in August, where big smallmouth lived when the weather turned. The river taught me patience and observation in a way that nothing else could have because it didn't care whether I was paying attention, it just kept moving. That time carved a path I've followed ever since into the fishing industry, into a life spent on and around water, into a career built on understanding what lives below the surface and why it matters. Not because I planned it that way, because the river got into me early and never left. And that's something my parents and grandparents gifted me. They were the ones who first put me on the water. They understood the river the way people used to understand rivers, not as a destination, but as a relationship, something you return to, something that knew you back in its own way. They passed that down to me not through a lesson or a presentation like this, but through time. Hours in a canoe, early morning riverside campsites, the particular quiet of moving water before the rest of the world wakes up. That's the thing about a love for rivers. You can't really teach it. You can only offer someone enough time near one and hope it catches on. I'm standing here today because a river in the Ozarks and the people who thought it was worth sharing. The watershed I grew up on and grew up in looks nothing like the St. Croix. Different geology, different fish species, a different history, but the feeling, the way water organizes your world, the way a river becomes part of how you think and who you are, that's the same. That's universal, which is exactly what I want to chat with you about today. So, this is the St. Croix River watershed. I would imagine that most of you are somewhere on this map at the moment. Um, but I want you to just take a second and picture this, okay? So if you can, everybody just close your eyes for a moment. It's raining, okay? And the water hits the street or your yard. Now really think about it. Where does it go? And don't say just into a drain, but where does it actually go after that? Now you can open your eyes again. Most of the time, we don't think about it. It disappears, out of sight, out of mind. But that water doesn't start, or sorry, it doesn't stop. It moves. And the direction it moves is controlled by something most people never notice, an invisible line across the land called a watershed divide. And where we're at, this line, if you guys can see my guys and guys can see my mouse, this line decides everything. And does anyone know what this line means on this northern boundary of the St. Croix Rivershed? Well, I'll tell you. On one side of it, the water flows back into the Great Lakes, right? And on this side, it all flows south into the St. Croix, into the Mississippi, and eventually all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. That means something pretty wild. Every time it rains, the water around you begins a journey that could end hundreds, even thousands of miles away, and it's all connected. The St. Croix watershed alone drains about 7,700 square miles. Now, I was always terrible at math in school, so I asked the computer what that meant. That's roughly 5 million football fields. 5 million football fields, all draining into one river system. Every yard, every street, every baseball field, all connected back to the same water. And here's the thing, that water doesn't stay, it doesn't stop, it moves, right? Now, I want you to just remember this little red dot here because at the end of this presentation, I'm going to show you a photo, and that is where I spend the vast majority of my time these days. So I'm kind of just outside of the St. Croix Rivershed, but still connected in a very interesting way. So long before roads or railroads, if you wanted to move people, goods, or even ideas across a continent, you followed water. Rivers weren't just useful, they were the only way. And for a long time, people understood that in a very real way. Before roads, before railroads, before Google Maps, if you wanted to go anywhere, you followed water. Rivers didn't just move people, they literally built the world we live in. Almost every major civilization, almost every major city, if you think about it, started near water. The Nile, the Rhine, the Mississippi. And here it was the St. Croix and the Mississippi. The reason that Minneapolis exists today is because of the Mississippi. The Ojibwe and Dakota peoples have been traveling this watershed for thousands of years before any Europeans set foot in it. The St. Croix wasn't a boundary to them or a state line, it was a corridor, a living road. Canoes moved through these waters carrying wild rice harvested from lakes to the north, copper traded from Lake Superior, and people traveling to gather, to trade, to visit relatives across what we now call Minnesota and Wisconsin. The river connected communities that otherwise would have been separated by thousands of miles of forest. One of the things that I think is very interesting to consider is I'm sure some of you have heard of Lewis and Clark. And Lewis and Clark traveled thousands and thousands of miles across the United States to the West Coast. And most of their travel was actually upstream. So think about that. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to walk against current in the river, right? It's very, very hard. It's easy to go downstream, right? But it's very difficult to go upstream. And they took their entire flotilla upstream, basically the entire way, all the way to the West Coast. So think about that. They were pushing boats upriver versus they're going against the grain, which is always blew my mind when I thought about Lewis and Clark. So the Namakagon, that feeds into the St. Croix. The St. Croix feeds into the Mississippi, and the Mississippi reaches the Gulf. It's all one continuous system, and the people who lived within it knew every bend, every portage, every seasonal change and current, and that knowledge was passed down through generations, not written in books, but carried in memory and practice in the act of returning to the same water year after year. That relationship wasn't just practical, it was their identity. The river wasn't something you used, it was something you belonged to. We kind of stopped paddling these routes except for fun, but something else never did. Can anyone take a guess of what that might be? Well, since I can't see any of you and I can't see the comments, I'll tell you, it's fish. So now I'm going to show you a map that I find very, very interesting. When you think about the Great Lakes, right? They're called lakes. But in reality, they're actually one giant river system, like the biggest river system in the world. And so I just wanted to share this map. This map is an elevation map. So think about if you were viewing all the lakes, but you could see the bottom of all of them in succession, right? And when you think about the Great Lakes, you don't really think of them as being a giant drainage river, but it is. It's very similar to the St. Croix in that the top part, in this instance, Duluth, is the highest part of the elevation as we talk about how the Great Lakes flood down to the Atlantic Ocean. And so this is how a lot of travelers back in the day actually ended up in our states is because they were able to stair step up through the Great Lakes. And as I mentioned earlier, that watershed divide that's on that northern end, right? Those rivers were flowing into the Great Lakes. So they, like Lewis and Clark, pulled their canoes and boats up, and then finally they got to that special little spot in northern Minnesota and Wisconsin where all of a sudden their life got a lot easier and they were able to flow downstream, right? All the way to the Gulf. And so I just wanted to preface this next slide with a little bit of a map because I want you guys to think about where this next map might be in relation to the Great Lakes. So here we have an above view of a certain section of the Great Lakes, okay? And what I'm about to show you is something that I find extremely interesting. So in the Great Lakes, through a partnership with some conservation groups, uh, muskies, if some of you are aware of maybe seen a muskie in your life, they're catching muskies and they're putting little air tags in them, right? Maybe some of you have an air tag on your motorcycle or your little e-bike, right? So your parents can keep track of you. Well, the scientists are doing the same thing with the muskies, right? So they catch them and they drop these little acoustic tags. Um, and periodically throughout the Great Lakes, they've dropped buoys with sounding devices. So if the fish gets in close enough proximity to these buoys, it pings and it tracks them. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is that this is a map from 2016 to 2020 of various muskies that have been tagged. And I want you to think about these fish as sort of the original travelers to the area and watch how far some of these dots go. And then at the end, I would like for someone to tell me which dot went the farthest. Each one of these is an individual fish making its annual migration through the Great Lakes. And I'll give you a little cheat. The big body of water where most of these muskies are sitting, that is Lake St. Clair. And then they're traveling through this little slice called the Huron River, and they're making their way into Lake Huron. And then at the very end to the right here, where you see some of them going all the way to the end, that's the Niagara River. Okay, so just keep your eyes peeled to see which one of these is going to go the farthest. Whoa, oh, whoa. We're going to play it one more time. That's cool with everybody. How far do you think that fish traveled? How far do you think that blue dot traveled? And then, if you guys were paying attention, I said I'd ask you later, but I'm bad at surprises. But I want you to pay attention to the one single red dot at the very end of this video. That fish from Lake St. Clair to the Niagara River with no map and no GPS traveled hundreds of miles to return to a place that it was more than likely born in, which is mind-boggling to me to think that some of these fish are traveling that far within this water system. So here we go. Whoa, crazy, right? Um, so how do these fish know where to go? Well, it's instinct, it's water temperature, it's current and chemistry that's been refined over millions of years. Fish are still using rivers as highways. They actually never stopped. While we built roads and airports and forgot about the water, everything living below the surface kept following the same routes, the same rhythms, the same logic that has always governed life on this continent, minus a few dams. It's not a small thing. That's a reminder that the system we inherited is older and smarter than anything we've ever built on top of it. Now I want to talk to you about my personal favorite fish, the smallmouth bass. They are one of the most well-studied fish in freshwater biology. That's me on the right holding a buddy's fish on a river just east of here in Wisconsin. And what they do across a single calendar year is one of the closest mirrors of human behavior you'll find in nature. In the summertime, a smallmouth is essentially a teenager with their own room. They're very territorial, competitive. No one is allowed in. You're like a smallmouth, staking out the best rock, the best feeding lane, the best position in the current. If another fish encroaches, or maybe, your little brother or sister, you might fight. Uh, Independence isn't just preferred, it's enforced. When resources are abundant and conditions are good, there's no incentive to share. Then October comes. Water temperatures drop, your metabolism slows, food gets harder to find, and something shifts. Smallmouth abandon their territories entirely. Fish that spent all summer competing for the same rock will now live within feet of each other in the deepest, most protected holes in the river. Sometimes hundreds of fish, like in this photo on the bottom left, um, will hold within feet of each other through an entire winter. They're not there because they're suddenly BFFs. They're there because proximity to each other is actually how they survived. The math changed, something I told you earlier that I'm terrible at, and they changed with it. They don't hold meetings about it. They don't negotiate. The conditions speak, and the fish listen. Think about the last times conditions may have gotten hard for you or the people around you. Maybe a sudden storm or a loss, a moment when the normal rules of everyday life are suspended. What happened to people? They move towards each other. They check on neighbors. Maybe they'd ignored all summer. They show up. That instinct to consolidate when things get hard isn't a weakness. It's one of the oldest survival strategies on Earth. Bass have been running it for millions of years. We just rediscover it every time things get difficult. The river doesn't just carry water, it carries behavior. And some of that behavior, it turns out, looks a lot like ours. So remember that little red dot I asked you to pay attention to at the beginning? That dot is right what we're looking at today. This is where I spend most of my time now. Everything I told you, this is what it looks like when it becomes your life. You see a place that looks simple on the surface, but now you kind of understand what's underneath it. The current moving below, the fish holding in deep water, the same routes being traveled that have always been traveled, a living system that was running long before this cabin was built and will keep running long after. And you might be tempted to walk away thinking it's all one thing, that it's all connected. Every river flows into every other river, and that is true. But there's a version of that idea that flattens something important, that treats river and people as interchangeable parts of a larger machine. That thinking is honestly how humans have justified a lot of damage to these ecosystems. The St. Croix has a character that the Mississippi doesn't. The Namakagon runs cold and clear through sand and pine in a way no other river in Wisconsin does. The James River in Missouri shaped me in ways I couldn't have predicted as a kid standing in it barefoot. None of those rivers are interchangeable, and neither are the people like yourselves who belong to them. For most of human history, rivers were how you got somewhere. Infrastructure, trade, survival, that world is mostly gone. We don't need the St. Croix to move lumber anymore. We have highways and freight lines and container ships. But rivers still connect us. It's just different now. When you're on the water, fishing, paddling, or standing at the edge of a stream, you're traveling routes that have been traveled for thousands of years, reading the same current, feeling the same cold, watching the same light move across some water that the Ojibwe watched, that every creature in that watershed has always watched. You're not recreating history, you're participating in something that never actually stopped. And below the surface, the same is true. That muskie you watch migrate hundreds of miles has never known a road or a border. Its entire world is water, current, temperature, and an ancient pull toward the next place that it needs to be. So when you cast a line into that water, you're crossing paths with something living entirely by the original rules of this continent. Rules that were here long before us and will outlast everything we've built on top of them. Every river you will ever stand on has been stood on before. Someone fished that exact bend in the river centuries ago, read the same eddy, felt that same cold move across their ankles, and thought, something is alive down there. And then they went home and told that story. You are part of that line. It runs from the first person who knelt at a riverbank, through the Ojibwe paddling the Namakagon, through my grandfather putting me on the James before I understood why it mattered, all the way to you standing at the edge of whatever water is closest to you. That line doesn't end with any of us, it runs through us. So get on the water, follow a river somewhere it takes you, be patient, and when you do catch something from below the surface, understand that you didn't just catch a fish, you cross paths with everything that has come before you. And with that, I will open it up to any questions that anybody has. I'm not a scientist, so I'll do my best to answer any questions that are science related. I do have a lot of fishing knowledge. If there's anyone who would like to ask any questions about fishing, I know we have a few more minutes here to discuss. So if anyone would like to follow up, please let me know.
Well, I'll hop on to help with this excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
It was very calming for an early morning.
Good.
So we have what is the biggest river as our first question?
The biggest river in the world or in
Whichever
the
one you want to answer.
United? Yeah. So the biggest river uh, in the United States is the Mississippi. And as I mentioned, which is kind of interesting, the watershed that I grew up on, so this watershed in Missouri and Arkansas, it actually takes a turn right here down in this Arkansas area and feeds into the bottom part of the Mississippi. And so when you look at this drainage and you start thinking about those 5 million football fields, the 5 million football fields of the St. Croix are just a tiny little piece of everything that's draining into the greater Mississippi River as it goes down and makes its way all the way to the Gulf. So when we think about people being unique and rivers being unique, this map is sort of duplicated multiple times as the Mississippi makes its way down to the Gulf of Mexico.
Hmm. Yeah.
The biggest river in the world is probably the Nile. I may be wrong. There may be a geography teacher in the mix that could correct me. It's been a while, but that would be my assumption, or the Amazon probably. Yeah. So
Yeah, it's one of those.
yeah.
Going back to the map where the muskies were going,
Yep.
Do you know why the dots are different colors on the map?
So those are different colors because of they're different fish, and it's a different time of it's a different uh they were tagged or they were caught and the tag was put in them at a different time. So my understanding is that the blue ones are sort of the ones that were caught in early 2016. You can kind of see down on the bottom there's a and so as we get later into 2017, they changed to yellow. And so these are each individual unique fish. Some of them could be duplicates. So if they pass by the same buoy, they're getting counted again. But as you'll notice, the colors sort of start to change as the years proceed. And so this is representative of muskies that have been, individual muskies that have been tagged at different times for them to kind of keep it
Mm,
straight.
gotcha. Hey, kind of going into fishing now.
Oh, cool.
What do you use to catch bass?
Oh, well, I use lots of stuff to catch bass. Some of my favorite baits, I work for a company that makes lures, and so I'm a little partial to using our products. But if I was going to fish the St. Croix, I would use a jerk bait, which is, hold on one second. A jerk bait is like a little mimic of a little bait fish, and it has a little bill, so it dives into the water and darts all around. My favorite bait for fishing the rivers around here is a Zoom fluke. And so if you guys want to look up a Zoom fluke and you actually rig it weightless, so you just put a hook through its nose and up through the body, and it's a little plastic uh, bait that kind of darts up out of the water. It's a soft plastic, and it's really nice for fishing the rivers because it's weedless. It doesn't get hooked up on stuff. But
Hmm.
the fish on the St. Croix and the Namakagon and the Chippewa and all of those rivers around us, they really like flukes. So that would definitely be one of my two options. And then the other one would be some sort of like crawdad imitation that you would just kind of drag along the bottom because throughout the season, um, fish change where in the water column, so from top to bottom, where they want to focus on feeding. So in the early spring, they're more inclined to chase little bait fish. And then in colder months, they'll slow down and they'll start to orientate and focus more on the bottom. And then in the summer, the best part is they get, especially smallmouth bass, really like to eat stuff on topwater, which is my favorite. So that would be my fourth and final bait would be some sort of like topwater bait that you can pop along the surface. But that's generally kind of towards the, well, you can kind of fish it all year on the river. So those would be my selections.
Gotcha. Is it true that if you get your hands wet before you touch a fish, it won't hurt them?
Yes, it's very important actually to get your hands wet before you grab a fish that has been in the water. So think about uh, fish have a protective slime on them. Some of them are more sensitive than others. So smallmouth bass are much hardier and can handle more stress than other fish. Trout are very, very sensitive, so you definitely want to get your hands wet before you touch a trout because it helps keep the protective slime on them.
Mm.
Muskies are actually, while they're the biggest, right? Not the biggest, like sturgeon are probably the biggest, but even though muskies are kind of the biggest predator, they are actually like really big babies. And so when you catch a muskie and you catch this giant toothy critter that you think is like super strong, they're actually really, really sensitive and they get tired very, very quick. And so you want to be extra, extra careful if you were to catch a muskie, you know? And one thing I'll say is if you're a kid and you're fishing, and your parents are helping support your habit, definitely ask for a net. It just makes life a lot easier for everybody. And allows you to keep the fish in the water as much as possible so you're not dragging it up on the rocks and stuff.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
You know.
Um, what is your favorite rod and your favorite bait?
Um, so I like to do all types of fishing. So I'll fly fish and I'll fish regular. If I was a kid starting out, I would definitely get kind of like a shorter spinning rod with like a size 2500 or 3000 size reel. It kind of allows you to do a little bit of everything. And my my favorite bait would be one of the ones I mentioned. Would be like a Megabass jerk bait or a fluke or a topwater or a crawdad.
Yeah. I kind of figured that'd be the answer, but
Yep.
what is your favorite fish to catch?
Man, it's so hard. It kind of depends. I spend most of my time bass fishing, and the cool thing about bass is they live everywhere, right? And so your opportunities to catch them are you have a lot of opportunities to engage with them.
Hmm.
And so they would be on the top of the list. There's a fish called a bonefish, which is down primarily kind of in the Bahamas, areas like that. They're like basically giant minnows. And when you hook one, they immediately go. And so those would probably be that would be my favorite fish to catch on a fly rod, bonefish.
Sounds fun.
Very fun.
Um, ooh, okay. What is the best bait for muskie?
Ooh, if I was going to fish for muskies in the St. Croix, like on a river, there's a guy by the name of Larry Dahlberg who is he actually lives on the St. Croix up on Taylor's Falls. He has an awesome TV show from back in the day, if you can find it, called Land Big Fish with Larry Dahlberg. He invented a bait called the Whopper Plopper. And there are a few different sizes. I actually prefer the size 90. And the great thing about that bait is that it'll catch smallmouth and it'll catch muskie on the river. The muskies really, really want to destroy that thing. So if I was a kid and I was trying to catch a muskie, it would probably be a Whopper Plopper 90. Yep.
The names for baits are just my favorite thing
Hilarious.
ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Do you have a favorite season to fish?
Hmm. This time of the year, so actually it's interesting because in the state of Minnesota, you used to not be able to fish smallmouth bass until later in the month of May, and the regulations just changed. And so you're actually able to fish smallmouth for catch and release all year now. And so what we in the fishing industry call pre-spawn, so it's before the fish start making baby smallmouth. This time of the year is really, really fun to be out fishing. And as Minnesotans, we haven't really got to experience it for decades. So right now is a great time to get out because they've all been like us, sitting around doing nothing all winter. And now it's like they're back in sports. They're hungry. They want to eat. They're eating as many snacks as they possibly can because they're outside running around. So this is a great time. And then fall can be really good, but honestly, my favorite time is generally around kind of like the end of May after the fish have moved off their beds, or kind of in that post-spawn area. You can catch a lot of really good ones pretty easily up around here. So that would probably be my choice.
Nice. Okay, I don't know if you'll know the answer to this one,
Okay.
but what is the most rare fish in the world?
The most rare fish in the world. Um, it kind of depends. It's a big question, right?
Mhm.
There are some really crazy saltwater fish that are highly sought after for anglers to catch. There's like big, beautiful, like parrotfish
Oh,
that
yeah.
they'll catch like on atolls, which are basically an atoll is like an old volcano formation rock reef in the middle of the ocean, and all these little random critters come around. There's another one that you'll see in like aquariums sometimes called a arapaima,
Hmm.
which is a big freshwater kind of brackish water fish that's kind of rare. But every fish is special, and I would say that um, catching any fish in a certain body of water can be just as special and unique as catching a rare fish. So if you find a smallmouth in a creek you didn't know there were smallmouth in, like to me, that's just as exciting as going after and chasing like something but there are a lot of species that are, been overfished and are becoming less prevalent. So that one's kind of a hard one. It kind of depends on where you're at in the world. I would say each continent kind of has a different one.
Hmm. Do you know of a rare fish in the St. Croix?
I mean, if I think of a rare fish in the St. Croix, I generally think of like sturgeon, which I
Mhm.
think people might hear about tomorrow.
Maybe.
I don't know. They're like giant dinosaurs, which have been around forever. Those are super cool and rare. Muskies are honestly pretty rare up here. They're getting harder and harder to find.
Yeah.
But there's also like each we're talking about like the fish that everybody wants to go catch for fun. But each river system has really unique and rare sort of like bottom fish, the ones
Mhm.
that the smallmouth and muskies may be feasting on, right? And so there's lots of like funny name fish like hognose suckers and things like that. So like the river that I grew up in has smallmouth, and it has shoal bass, which are very odd. They're kind of red-eyed smallmouth combinations between a spotted bass and a smallmouth.
Mhm.
But the forage fish, the fish that everybody's eating in the river system, are extremely different. And so each little stream is going to have its own unique characteristics as to what's kind of floating around in it. And some of our rivers up here we're very lucky that they actually at the headwaters tend to have trout in them too, which is cool. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I have one more question.
Hmm.
What is the biggest fish you ever caught?
Oh, right. The biggest fish I ever caught was I got to go down to Mexico in like Baja, and I'll see if I can find a photo here. Um, I've caught some really, really big muskies, but this one was the biggest one. I don't know if you guys can see that,
Oh my goodness.
but that is like a giant sailfish down in Baja. And the cool thing about that is it was literally like fishing in an aquarium. And so there were whales breaching, eating big clumps of krill and bait fish. And then there were turtles and sea lions everywhere. And then these huge schools of sailfish swimming all around. And so that's the biggest probably saltwater fish I've ever caught. But I'll see since there's someone who's interested. Let me see if I can find. I'll show you the biggest muskie. Let me just see if I can find it quickly. Um, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to
Like
track
always
it
when you're
down
under
in time.
pressure.
Yeah, I've caught uh some big muskies that are like 50 inches long. So yeah. And I would say that, everybody always wants to catch the biggest fish, but I think as long as you're going out and you're having a great time and even if you don't catch anything, like remembering kind of what I was saying in the presentation that it's kind of a blessing that you're able to stand where everyone else has stood before you and experience what you're getting to experience. So I've had lots of days where I haven't caught anything, and that's what keeps you coming back.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your stories. I know I appreciated it. I'm sure that all of the students we have on today also appreciated it. Um, if anyone has any more questions, you can always reach out to me and I will see if I can get some answers for you. But otherwise, I hope to see everyone at 10:30 for our next speakers. We have a couple scientists from the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway to talk about mussels. So,
Ooh, cool.
yeah. So I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.